The arrest that shook a nation. Millbrook was a town with unspoken rules. Keep your head down. Don't ask questions. And above all, never ever challenge the authority of a police officer. For generations, the badge had been both shield and weapon, wielded by those who upheld a system that punished the powerless and protected the privileged. Everyone in town knew it. Everyone, except Derek Cole, or rather, he knew, but he refused to play along. Maybe it was the years he'd spent in the military, or maybe it was the simple fact that he had risked his life overseas believing in justice, only to come home and find that justice had different rules here. Either way, Derek had never been one to bend the knee, and that was the mistake that landed him in a jail cell, bruised and bloody, while a corrupt precinct tried to erase him from existence. But they underestimated him. Because the first rule of combat is simple: never corner a soldier who has nothing left to lose. The evening run that started it all. The sun dipped low over Veterans Memorial Park, casting golden streaks over the jogging trail as Derek Cole finished his evening run. His German shepherd, Shadow, trotted beside him, matching his pace with effortless precision. A trained military dog, Shadow never let his handler drift too far, his intelligent brown eyes constantly scanning for anything out of place. To the average onlooker, Derek looked like any other man out for a run. Athletic build, worn-down running shoes, sweat-stained hoodie. Nothing special. But beneath the surface, Derek was a machine of discipline and instinct. 12 years in the military, 4 of them spent in special operations, had honed his reflexes to a razor's edge. Even now, back in civilian life, those instincts never fully faded. That's why he noticed the police cruiser immediately. The same one that had circled the block 3 times. The same pair of officers who had been watching him a little too closely from across the park. He had seen that look before. It was the same look they had given him when he first moved back to Millbrook, the kind that said, "You don't belong here." A town that never changed. Millbrook wasn't some war zone. It wasn't a city drowning in crime. It was a quiet, middle-class town where people smiled at their neighbors and police officers waved at passing cars. If you were one of them. But if you weren't, you were a problem. It didn't matter that Derek had served his country. Didn't matter that he ran a successful security consulting firm now, helping businesses and organizations strengthen their protection strategies. Didn't matter that he had earned the right to be respected. Because to men like Sergeant Rick Marshall, a tall black man in a town like this was automatically suspicious. And tonight, that suspicion was about to turn violent. The gas station stop. After his run, Derek drove home with Shadow curled up in the back seat, enjoying the crisp October air filtering through the open window. He was 3 blocks from home when he spotted the gas station's glowing red and blue neon sign. His fuel gauge was low, and he had a packed schedule the next day. Might as well fill up now. The station was mostly empty, just a few cars parked near the pumps, and 1 police cruiser stationed near the convenience store. As Derek swiped his card at the pump, he felt their eyes on him. 2 officers standing inside the store, pretending to browse. Watching. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay relaxed. They were waiting for something. An excuse, a reason. Then, just as he finished paying, it happened. The first mistake. A commotion near the convenience store entrance. Derek turned his head, instinct kicking in before he could even think. 2 officers had a teenager pressed against the wall, his hands raised, his face a mask of barely contained fear. He was young, no more than 15 or 16, still dressed in a high school letterman jacket. His mouth moved, speaking rapidly, but Derek was too far to hear. The officers, however, weren't interested in what he had to say. One of them, Sergeant Rick Marshall, leaned in close, towering over the kid like a predator playing with its prey. Derek had seen that stance before. The deliberate intimidation, the manufactured tension, the slow escalation designed to push the kid into reacting, so they could justify what came next. It was the same playbook, different chapter. And it made his blood boil. The second mistake. Derek could have walked away. He knew how this town worked. Knew that stepping in could paint a target on his own back. But he also knew what it felt like to be cornered. To be young and afraid, standing against men with the power to destroy you if you made even the smallest mistake. So he didn't walk away. He approached, carefully, deliberately, making sure his hands were visible, making sure he didn't do anything that could be misinterpreted. "Evening, officers," Derek said, his voice level. "Everything all right here?" Marshall turned slowly, like a wolf annoyed that someone had interrupted its meal. "Keep walking," he said flatly. "This doesn't concern you." Derek held his ground. "Kid looks scared," he said. "And your body cameras aren't on." Marshall's jaw tightened. Derek didn't miss the way the second officer shifted uncomfortably. There was doubt there, uncertainty, but Marshall was the leader here, and men like him didn't like to be questioned. His lips curled into a smirk. "You a cop?" "No," Derek said, unblinking. "I'm a veteran." Marshall's smirk disappeared. "Oh," he said slowly. "You one of those guys who comes back from playing war and thinks you're still in charge." Derek's pulse ticked higher. He had dealt with men like this before. Men who hated anyone stronger than them. Men who hated being challenged. "That kid's not resisting," Derek said. "Let him go." The second officer hesitated. He wasn't sure anymore. That's when Marshall made his decision. The third mistake. Marshall took a step forward, eyes gleaming with malice. "You want to play hero?" He sneered. "All right." His hand went to his radio. Derek felt the trap closing before it even snapped shut. The second police cruiser pulled up behind him, its lights flashing. Two more officers. Shadow growled low in the car, sensing the shift in energy. Marshall smiled. Hands on the hood. Derek exhaled slowly. "I haven't committed any crime." Marshall grinned wider. "Suspicious activity. Loitering. Interfering with an investigation. Take your pick." Derek knew exactly what was happening. They were pushing him, hoping he would react. But he wasn't some kid they could intimidate. So he did the one thing they didn't expect. He stayed calm. "I'm going to reach for my ID now," Derek said, his voice even. He moved slowly, keeping his movements deliberate, controlled. Marshall watched him carefully. Then, just as Derek handed over his license, the officer shoved him. Hard. Derek stumbled backward, his military instincts kicking in as he caught himself. And that was the moment Marshall had been waiting for. "Resisting arrest," he shouted. The next thing Derek knew, he was slammed against the hood of his car, his arms twisted behind him. Shadow barked frantically, but he stayed trained, stay put. Through the ringing in his ears, Derek heard the crackle of cell phone cameras. Someone was filming. That meant there were witnesses, which meant Marshall had to finish this quickly. And Derek knew exactly what was coming next. The thin line between authority and corruption. The cold steel of the police cruiser's hood pressed against Derek Cole's cheek as the weight of Sergeant Rick Marshall's knee bore down between his shoulder blades. This wasn't his first time on the ground. He had been knocked down before, on battlefields in foreign lands, in places where bullets cracked the air and explosions turned night into day. He had been pinned beneath enemies who wanted him dead, who would have gutted him if not for the training that made him faster, sharper, and more dangerous than they expected. But this was different. This wasn't war. This wasn't an ambush by insurgents in the dead of night. This was home. Or at least, it was supposed to be. When a system is built against you, stop resisting. Marshall's voice was a mockery, a performance. Derek wasn't moving, hadn't moved. But the sergeant needed the illusion of resistance, needed a justification for what he had already decided to do. Derek felt the first blow to his ribs before he even had time to brace, a sharp, crushing pain that sent a white-hot jolt through his chest. Then another. His breath hitched. This wasn't a takedown. This wasn't procedure. This was punishment for daring to question. for daring to stand. Through the haze of pain, Derek caught a glimpse of movement, phones held up, recording. They weren't hiding it. They weren't afraid. Because they had never faced consequences before, and in their minds, they never would. The dog that wouldn't be silenced. A snarl cut through the chaos. A deep, guttural sound. Low, controlled, but filled with warning. Shadow. The German shepherd stood rigid in the open car door, his hackles raised, his powerful body coiled like a spring. His dark eyes locked onto Marshall, tracking his every movement. "Call off your mutt," the second officer muttered, shifting uneasily. Marshall ignored him. He reached for Derek's dog tags, the metal still dangling from his neck, and yanked. The chain snapped. The clink of metal against pavement felt louder than the sirens in Derek's head. Shadow's growl deepened into something primal, something lethal. The crowd inched closer. People had seen cops arrest a man before. But this was different. They weren't watching an arrest. They were watching a crime. A system that protects its own. Another police cruiser pulled up. A third one. This was no longer about controlling a situation. This was about controlling the narrative. A young female officer stepped out, her gaze flicking between Derek, the crowd, and the other officers. She saw the phones. She saw the fear in the teenager's eyes. She saw what was really happening. But she didn't move, didn't interfere, because stepping in meant crossing a line. And in Millbrook, that line was the difference between having a badge and becoming a target. The man who wouldn't stay silent. Marshall leaned down, his breath hot against Derek's ear. "You don't belong here," he murmured. Derek didn't flinch, didn't give him the satisfaction. He let out a slow breath, forcing his pulse to steady. "Neither do you," he said. Marshall's grip tightened. "Let's see how tough you are down at the station." He hauled Derek up by the cuffs, shoving him toward the back seat of the cruiser. Derek's vision blurred, but not from pain. From memory. From the feeling of being transported not to a jail cell, but to a holding camp in a war zone. The feeling of not being treated as a person, but as a problem to be handled. Shadow whimpered as the doors slammed shut. And for the first time in a long time, Derek felt something he hadn't felt since the worst days of combat. Trapped. A call that shook the Pentagon. The ride to the Millbrook precinct was silent. Marshall didn't gloat, didn't sneer, because he didn't have to. He thought he had already won. Derek stared out the window, breathing slow, measured breaths. His hands were cuffed. His ribs were bruised. But he wasn't powerless. Because Marshall had made a mistake. A big one. And he didn't even know it yet. Some people are not to be touched. The station was quiet when they arrived. The officers at the desk barely looked up, because this wasn't new. Wasn't special. Just another man in cuffs, another file to be buried. They processed Derek with chilling efficiency. Photos, fingerprints, a cell with a flickering light, and a stale stench of forgotten men. Then came the waiting. For what, Derek wasn't sure. Then he heard the phone ring. Not the station line. Not a normal call. The direct line. The one only a few people had access to. The chief of police picked up. A pause. A long, terrifying pause. Then, his face went pale. The words that followed changed everything. The call that changed everything. "Sir." A longer pause. Then, "Yes, yes, of course. Right away." The phone clicked, and everything changed. Officers who had ignored him now whispered in frantic tones. The female officer from earlier glanced at Derek's cell, her face caught somewhere between relief and fear. Then came the sound of heavy boots. And the last thing Derek expected to hear. Get him out. Now. The Pentagon's reach. The cell door swung open. Marshall stood in the doorway. But he wasn't smirking anymore. He wasn't in control anymore. Because standing behind him was a man in a crisp black suit, his ID badge bearing the unmistakable insignia of the United States Pentagon. His voice was calm, but absolute. "Sergeant Marshall," he said, "I suggest you step aside." Marshall opened his mouth to protest, and then 3 more men in suits stepped in behind him. Derek straightened. He knew who they were, knew exactly what had happened. Someone had made a call, someone who outranked everyone in this building. And now the entire system was about to collapse. Marshall had thought he was dealing with just another civilian. What he didn't realize was that Derek Cole wasn't just a veteran. He was a former special operations officer with top-level clearances, and when someone like him goes missing, the Pentagon starts asking questions, and when the Pentagon asks questions, entire departments start to crumble. Marshall's face was a mask of rage, but he knew it was over. And as Derek stepped out of the cell, his eyes locked onto the sergeants with one clear message: "You should have never touched me." The unraveling of power. The walls of Millbrook Precinct had stood for decades, their steel and brick embodying a system that thrived on silence and submission. The very foundation of this place had been built not on justice, but on fear, the fear of questioning authority, the fear of standing out, the fear of resisting those who held the power. For years, the people of Millbrook had learned one lesson above all: you do not challenge the badge. And yet, on this night, in the dimly lit halls of the precinct, something unprecedented was happening. A man who was supposed to be another statistic, another lost case, buried in paperwork and erased from memory, was walking free. Not because the system had granted him justice, but because someone higher up had forced its hand. And in a place like Millbrook, where corruption thrived in the shadows, the sudden exposure to light was about to burn everything down. A prisoner no more. Derek Cole felt the shift the moment the Pentagon officials stepped into the station. It was subtle at first, the small changes in body language, the way officers suddenly found themselves unsure of their footing, how their once commanding presence had shrunk in the face of something greater than their authority. Then there was Marshall, the man who had yanked him from his car, the man who had pressed his knee into his back, who had mocked his service, who had broken his dog tags as if they were nothing. Now that same man stood silent, his body tense with unspoken rage, as the Pentagon official addressed him with the icy detachment of a man accustomed to making things disappear. "Sergeant Marshall," the suited man repeated, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "I suggest you step aside." Marshall hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, slowly, reluctantly, he took a step back. The moment the cuffs were removed, Derek straightened, rolling his shoulders, inhaling deeply as the weight of false imprisonment lifted. They had expected him to crawl out of that cell. He didn't. He walked out tall, controlled, every step deliberate. The entire room watched. And in that moment, they all understood something terrifying. Derek Cole was not a man to be silenced. The moment everything changed. Marshall wasn't done. Even as Derek walked toward the exit, the surgeon's pride, his grip on the power he had abused for years, would not let him stay silent. "You don't get to walk out of here like you own the place, Cole," he snapped. Derek stopped. The room fell silent. He turned slowly, meeting Marshall's glare with a look of quiet certainty. "I don't have to own it," Derek said. "I just have to tear it down." A murmur rippled through the precinct. Marshall's eyes narrowed. He had spent years operating with impunity, his name whispered in fear. And now, for the first time, someone wasn't afraid of him. Derek could see it. The moment doubt crept into Marshall's expression. And that was when the Pentagon official decided to twist the knife. "You should listen to him, Sergeant," the man said, taking the slow step forward. "Because as of 5 minutes ago, your department is under federal review." Marshall's jaw locked. "You can't do that." The official tilted his head. "Oh, we can." He pulled a folder from his briefcase, flipping it open. This precinct has accumulated 17 complaints of excessive force in the past year alone, 10 of them tied directly to you. He turned a page. Body cam footage missing in over 23 cases, complaints filed, and mysteriously lost before they reached review boards. Another page. Then there's the peculiar pattern of traffic stops involving Black and Latino men that somehow result in arrests without charges. The official closed the folder and stared Marshall down. "Would you like me to continue?" For the first time, Marshall had no words. Derek watched the surgeon's confidence crumble, the weight of the reality crashing down on him. "You think you can just march in here and tear this department apart?" Marshall finally managed, his voice strained with desperation. The official smiled. "We don't have to." He glanced toward the group of officers standing in the background. Officers who had, up until now, stayed silent. "We've already seen the footage. We know what happened here tonight." He turned back to Marshall. "And judging by the way your own officers are looking at you right now, I think they've seen enough too." The house of cards begins to fall. Silence. A long, painful silence. Then, movement. The young female officer, the one who had been present during Derek's arrest, stepped forward. She hesitated, then swallowed hard, her fingers tightening into fists. "I saw everything," she said. "I saw what he did." Marshall spun toward her, his eyes blazing. "You don't get to." But another officer stepped forward. Then another. And another. Derek watched, arms crossed, as the thin blue wall that had protected Marshall for years began to crack. "You've covered for him long enough," the Pentagon official said. "But understand this. If you stay silent now, when the investigation starts rolling in full force, you'll go down with him." That was all it took. Marshall turned on them, looking for support. There was none. He was alone. For the first time in years, he was alone. And he knew it. When a predator becomes prey. Marshall's hands curled into fists, his entire body trembling with fury. His voice, once filled with swagger and unchecked confidence, had turned desperate. "This is my department," he growled. "You think some damn veteran and a couple of suits can." But he never finished. Because at that moment, another voice cut through the air. "Sergeant Rick Marshall, you are under arrest." A different officer stepped forward, the internal affairs investigator assigned to the precinct. Marshall froze. He let out a bitter laugh. "You're joking." The investigator shook his head. "No joke, Rick." The click of handcuffs sent a ripple of shock and awe through the station. For the first time, the power had shifted. And as Marshall's own men placed him in cuffs, he looked at Derek with a mixture of hate and fear. Derek simply smiled. "Should have left me alone, Sergeant." The aftermath. The moment Marshall was taken away, the air in the station changed. It wasn't instant redemption, wasn't true justice yet, but it was a start. The Pentagon officials stayed behind, making it clear that the investigation wasn't just beginning. It was going to be relentless. Derek exhaled, rolling his sore shoulders. "Time to go, Cole," one of the officials said. Derek nodded. He didn't need to say anything else. His work here was done. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, he felt lighter despite the bruises. Waiting for him, loyal as ever, was Shadow, sitting beside his car. The dog perked up at the sight of him, tail wagging. Derek crouched, rubbing behind Shadow's ears. "You knew I'd come back," he murmured. Shadow licked his face in response. Derek smiled, because he had won. But more importantly, for the first time in a long time, so had justice. The reckoning begins. The air outside the Millbrook police precinct felt different. Crisp, cool, lighter. For the first time in years, the weight of corruption that had lingered over this town like a storm cloud was starting to lift. Derek Cole took a slow breath, rolling his shoulders to shake off the lingering ache from the beating he had endured just hours ago. His ribs were sore, his knuckles scraped, but he felt something deeper than pain. He felt free. Shadow, his loyal German shepherd, stood beside him, watching him with sharp, intelligent eyes. He had waited, trusted, knew his handler would find his way back. Derek ran a hand over the dog's head, a silent reassurance. "We're still standing, boy," he murmured. Shadow wagged his tail, letting out a low, approving huff. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled Derek from the quiet moment. He turned to see the Pentagon official, the man who had walked into that station and shut down an entire precinct with nothing but authority and facts. "We need to talk," the man said, his voice calm but firm. Derek nodded, falling into step beside him as they moved toward a sleek black SUV parked near the curb. "How bad is it?" Derek asked. The official smirked. "For you, not bad at all. For them, a complete disaster." When the system starts to collapse. Millbrook had always operated under the belief that it was untouchable, that no one was watching, that no one would ever care enough to challenge it. But they had miscalculated. Because when you arrest a decorated special ops veteran on false charges and beat him in a jail cell, you don't just create another victim. You create a problem. A highly trained, dangerously persistent problem. One that the government does not take kindly to. And now, the reckoning had begun. The fallout nobody expected. The Pentagon official leaned against the SUV, flipping through a folder filled with classified reports and official complaints. "Let's break it down," he said, pulling out a few documents. "The footage of your arrest, already sent to federal oversight. The complaints against this department, being pulled up for review as we speak. And as for your buddy Marshall," the man grinned, "he's going away for a long, long time." Derek raised an eyebrow. "You got him on more than just me, didn't you?" The official nodded. "You were just the tipping point. The guy's been dirty for years. Extortion, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, you name it. The only reason he lasted this long is because nobody dared to challenge him." He gestured back toward the precinct. "Until now." Derek let that sink in. The years of unchecked authority, the untouchable reputation, the fear Marshall had built around himself, it was all crumbling. And the best part, he had done it to himself. A message that can't be ignored. Derek turned, glancing at the people still gathered outside the station. Some were just curious onlookers, whispering among themselves. Others were residents who had been waiting for this moment their whole lives. And then there were the ones who had recorded everything. Those videos, the ones of Marshall dragging Derek from his car, the beating, the arrest, the moment the Pentagon stepped in, were already spreading. This wasn't going to stay just another small-town scandal. This was national. People were watching, listening. And now that they had seen the truth, there was no going back. The final blow. Derek turned back to the Pentagon official. "So, what happens next?" The man closed the folder with a satisfying snap. "Next, the FBI takes over. They'll rip through this department from the inside out. Every case they ever buried. Every innocent person they locked up. Every abuse of power. It all comes out." Derek nodded. He should have felt angry that it had taken this long. That people had suffered for years before anyone had stepped in. But for now, he would settle for the fact that it was finally happening. Justice wasn't instant. It wasn't clean. But tonight, for the first time, it was real. One last warning. As Derek turned to leave, the Pentagon official placed a hand on his shoulder. "Word of advice," he said. Derek raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." The man exhaled. "You made enemies tonight." Derek's lips curled into a smirk. "Wouldn't be the first time." "Yeah, well, these aren't the kind you faced overseas. This is a different kind of war. Corrupt cops, small-town politics, people who built their careers on keeping things buried. They're going to hate you for this. They're going to try and paint you as the villain." Derek took a slow breath. Then he looked the official dead in the eyes and said, "Let them try. Because Derek Cole wasn't just some veteran who got lucky. He wasn't some case to be closed. He was a soldier. And if there was one thing a soldier knew better than anything else, it was how to fight. A town that would never be the same. The lights of Millbrook glowed dimly in the distance as Derek drove home. Shadow curled up in the passenger seat. The weight of the night still hung over him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. He glanced down at his dog tags, the ones Marshall had broken, now resting in his hand. The chain had snapped, but the metal had endured, just like him. With a small smile, he placed the tags back around his neck and looked ahead at the open road. Millbrook had tried to bury him, but instead, he had buried them. The legacy of one man's stand. The fallout from that night would last for months. Investigations, indictments, resignations. The Millbrook Police Department would never recover. Neither would Sergeant Rick Marshall. And as for Derek Cole, he didn't need revenge, didn't need validation, because he knew he had already won. The story that couldn't be silenced. By the next morning, the videos had gone viral. The world had seen what happened in Millbrook. And across the country, in towns just like this one, people began to ask the same question. How many others had been silenced? How many others had suffered in the dark, without anyone to fight for them? That was the thing about truth. Once it gets out, it doesn't stop. It spreads. It grows. And for the first time, in a long time, Millbrook was out of places to hide. A final thought. Derek pulled into his driveway, stepping out into the crisp morning air. Shadow followed, sticking close as they walked toward the house. Before stepping inside, Derek paused. He glanced up at the sky, inhaled the fresh air, and whispered, not in anger, not in defiance, but in quiet, satisfied certainty. They picked the wrong man to silence. And with that, he shut the door behind him. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.